Hello, good evening, good evening, good evening. Thanks everyone for being here. My name is Jess Pettit, and I'm going to turn things over to Stevie Tran. That is amazing that she's able to join us today. And I'll let you introduce yourself first.
Oh, fantastic. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name is Stevie Tram. My pronouns are she and her, and I am a member of Sigma Phi Beta. I actually started my Greek journey at Arizona State all the way back. I don't even know. Let's not say the year. At Arizona State as a very young undergrad, and my gender identity, my gender expression certainly is not the same as it is now. And along my journey, I met individuals like Jess Pettit, who supported me in my kind of coming to uh, terms with my truth as a fraternity member and in kind of exploring what this all means for individuals like ourselves from the LGBTQ community and the space that we can create for each other within fraternities and sororities. And so I'm very excited to be here with Jess Pettit, my dear, dear friend, who has supported me along my own journey from the very beginning. And so I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself, Jess.
Well, thank you very much. And I think when we were initially given, or at least for me, when I was initially given the invitation to do this webinar, specifically on sisterhood and what this has to do with my own identities and who I am, I couldn't think of anybody else other than Stevie to kind of join me in this journey because it's a very rare opportunity as a former student affairs professional. So I ran the LGBT Center at the University of Arizona, Bear Down. And that is how originally I met Stevie as the advisor to Gamma Rho Lambda, running the LGBT and the Women's Center. And I think that it's a really rare moment as a student affairs professional that you, one, actually stay in touch with a student as they become an adult. And then, as not as an adult, I shouldn't say that, as a professional, a working professional adult. But then the next step is that Stevie has really become a leader in the field specifically related to fraternities and sororities around gender identity and expression. And I learn from her all of the time. So we've gone kind of
Mhm.
full circle. And I'm really honored to be able to share the webinar time with my colleague, Stevie Tran. When
Yes.
I don't work in student affairs anymore. I'm now a consultant and do work mostly for outside of the education realm, so associations or corporate work around broad stroke diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, fraternities and sororities, and specifically Delta Gamma, have kind of a special place, mostly in my volunteer work. I was an alumni initiate of Delta Gamma at Chi Epsilon. I always say it backwards. Epsilon Chi. One is the secret group in AFA that we don't talk about, and the other one is the University of South Carolina that isn't a chapter anymore because it did eventually close. But I joined when I was in graduate school in the early 2000s, and it's really nice to be here. So thank you
Yeah.
very much.
And so if I could maybe plug you a little bit, Jess actually co-authored one of the first publications on kind of transgender membership, navigating that issue within fraternities and sororities. And something that we had a conversation with before I was heading off to law school was how, I could maybe supplement that piece with a legal perspective. And that's exactly what we did after you sent out that publication, is that we worked together
Mm.
to create that legal perspective. And that's kind of where I am now, offering kind of legal services to culturally based fraternal organizations, our friends from racial, multicultural, ethnic backgrounds, and supporting the civic and social development for our peers of color who are also part of our fraternity and sorority community, and uplifting those voices, especially during this time where, diversity, equity, and inclusion are so important. A lot of these individuals within CBFOs have been working on these issues for a number of years. And so there's a lot that we can learn from each other, I think, on this topic.
Absolutely. So I know that Stevie, you're going to kick things off with some
Yes.
kind of basics, And
Yes.
what we mean by basics may not be basic for everyone, but we know that this recording is going to get forwarded around as a resource, etc. We don't know who all is in the audience, and so we wanted to make sure that they're how we're using language or how Stevie and I kind of operate with particular operational terms. So Stevie, why don't you do just some kind of general overview of some basics, and then I'll talk about some of the basics that I've done across 5 different councils, the two-pronged approach. Go ahead.
So absolutely. And so for those of you who are on today's webinar, this is being recorded and is going to be on Delta Gamma's website. So please know that this will be a resource that will be uploaded for your reference forever. And so we'll start kind of just with basic terminology, as Jess and I are going to have our conversation this evening. We'll be using some certain terms, and so just getting us on the same page. And so first I want to start off between kind of making the distinction between sex and gender. So sex quite literally is, just what we have between our legs. So when we're a baby, we pop out, happy crying baby. And there's a medical professional who kind of examines each of us and then makes a determination as to whether to put us in the male or the female box. And usually that's through, examination of physical genitalia. And there are those of us who may be born with not so clear genitalia. And so, it's not everyone who can so neatly fit into male and female. But just thinking about sex then, there's that kind of, okay, penis, vagina, and then gender. Gender is kind of the expectations that we place on a certain sex. So for those individuals who were assigned male at birth, you're going to be expected to behave a certain way. You'll, probably are rougher, play with toys like trucks and in the dirt, and are encouraged to play sports. And whereas for those who are assigned female at birth, maybe you'll be encouraged to be a little bit more gentle and emotional and soft. And so you'll get dolls and play clothes and things like that. And so we can see how kind of sex and gender can become kind of interrelated, but they're kind of very distinct concepts. And so when Jess and I talk about sex, it's almost quite literally just, penis, vagina, and gender is kind of what we expect, how we expect people to act, dress based upon the genitalia that we have. When we talk about sexual orientation, that's who we're attracted to, and that's a little bit different than gender identity. And so I like to say that sexual orientation is who we go to bed with, and gender identity is who I go to bed as. I could go bed by myself and I'll be the same person every night because that's my gender identity. And so sexual orientation is a little bit different, not the same, even though you might see LGBTQ all in this one acronym. So that's just something to be mindful about. And, gender identity, I think, is a new term for many of us. But I would posit that everyone has a gender identity. You just may not be as cognizant of it as a trans person. So as a organization for women, I think that there's definitely times, especially during your collegiate years, where you're probably just coming into yourselves, where you'll be faced with expectations like, what am I going to do after college? When am I going to get married? Am I going to have kids? When am I going to have kids? Am I going to stay at home after I get married? And for those of us who may identify as men, there are certain expectations like men don't cry, be tough, be strong. You got to make the most money for the family, and you're the breadwinner. And so when you find yourself pushing back against these expectations and saying, no, that's not what womanhood means to me, that's your gender identity speaking to you. It just may never have been phrased to you that way. And you may have never have been cognizant. It just comes across as, oh, I'm a woman, I'm a man. But for trans people, it's not just these moments that kind of make our gender identity kind of come to the forefront of our consciousness, but it's day-to-day activities like which line we get into in class during school, or what toys we're encouraged to play with, who we're encouraged to play with on the playground. And so when we're younger, ages 4, 5, or 6, obviously, I certainly would not have had access to words like gender identity, gender expression, sex, gender. my way of articulating how I felt when I had these encounters was that something was wrong. So those were the words that I had as a kid. And when I first started realizing that I may be different, there's something really different about me. And so, but I phrased it through, there's something wrong with me. And so that definitely impacted, my, how I felt within my family, and kind of how safe I felt growing up. And so that's just something to think about when you hear the term gender identity. And then, time kind of just to take it to the next level, and we'll definitely address this later on in the conversation as well. But as we talk about transgender members and transgender individuals, I know that some of the conversation now revolves around non-binary individuals. And so non-binary is a gender identity. It aligns similar to those who identify as men, those who identify as women. There's non-binary as well. So that is a gender identity. And it is, I would say kind of a rejection of male and female, and kind of, just take it from there and then letting the person fill in the holes after that. But if you kind of just remember, non-binary is something between male, female, outside of male and female, that'll put you, I think, in the right spot. And so, being non-binary is different than being gender non-conforming. Anyone can be gender non-conforming if you're, regardless of if you're trans or not. So, for example, I'll pick on Jess for a little bit. So Jess has short hair, which could be gender non-conforming in certain feminine circles. Jess has blue and red hair, which also could be gender non-conforming in certain feminine circles. Jess has on a collared shirt, which could be also gender non-conforming because maybe Jess should be expected to wear a blouse. And so, so there's an example of gender non-conforming. And so, men who wear pink shirts could also be perceived to be gender non-conforming. Purple, certain colors also can be gender non-conforming. So just that distinction to be aware of, that non-binary is a gender identity, whereas gender non-conformity is something that we can all experience. And so that's kind of alphabet soup that I have thrown at everyone. I'm not sure if Jess, if you've had some additional thoughts to help fill in the holes where I left off.
Sure. I think that in both of our work with organizations, and again, Stevie and I have both worked across 5 different councils, from national offices for organizations that have those, as well as kind of national volunteers that are heading up smaller organizations, to university chapter level alumni, volunteers, etc. There's the first kind of the structure around sex, gender identity, gender roles, gender expression, the explaining the difference between non-binary and gender non-conforming, I think, is a really important piece. And then I really liked, Stevie, how you talked about the expectations, right? So specifically, if we start talking about being a queer person in a sorority, there's a lot of expectations of what it means to be in a sorority or in an all-women's group. And that comes with some gender performance or gender expectations. So it's funny, actually, that you picked this shirt. So this is a lady blouse. It is silk and it buttons in the right direction. And I wore it because I'm speaking to a sorority. And I was like, oh no, I can't wear that. I have to wear girl clothes today. So I am wearing hard pants and a lady blouse. But a lady blouse to me still doesn't necessarily register quite as feminine enough, right? So how am I going to fit in? So right now, this is very long hair for me as well. But to other people, it is perceived as short hair. So when we start talking about our sense of self and our development of our own sexual identity, our own sexual orientation, our gender identity, our gender expression, it's really important to understand that alphabet soup that Stevie was talking about and how it comes into our own development, but also our judgments and assumptions about other people, people who might be in our organizations, people who might not be in our organizations, as well as who we begin to develop relationships with or not develop relationships with. So I think that's a really important piece to start with. The kind of work that we do, if that's at the foundation, often is working with what I refer to as the two-prong approach. And that is that as single gender organization, I would not say that fraternities and sororities are single sex organizations, because as Stevie described, usually genitalia, hormones, things like that are not part of your ritual. I don't know what all you do, but it's probably not part of the ritual. And if it is, perhaps you should think about that. But anyway, so it's not a single sex because you don't actually know hormonal, chromosomal, or biological genitalia havings or not havings. They're actually single gendered sororities and fraternities and legally allowed to do that. And the more specific you are, the more protected. What I've learned from Stevie is that it actually protects your freedom of assembly. Fraternities and sororities are exempt from Title IX work, even though Title IX comes up all of the time. You're not a federally funded educational organization, and you can be as specific as you would like about your membership. So, what happens when we start talking about sex and gender is that a lot of organizations eep and then they outsource these decisions to documentation, the registrar's office, the DMV, about who can become a member. That's prong one. Or someone is a member and they change their gender identity or gender expression while they are a member. So prong two is who can stay a member. So a lot of the work that I've done over the last decade, 2 decades, like who needs time or age, the work that I've done with different organizations has really been trying to address who can become a member and who can stay a member. And those conversations have primarily been very binary within kind of a born this way, now living this way, before they initiate, after they cross, something like that kind of conversation. So then when I would raise non-binary or gender non-conforming folks, it really often shut down the conversation. Similarly, the second prong of once they're in, what do you do? Most organizations didn't really address that, certainly not publicly in any kind of policy or procedures, because numerically they kind of thought each chapter just kind of handle it themselves, which kind of passive aggressively means that they're either stay a chapter member and no one knows about it, or they get shunned and left. But one of the reasons, again, why I wanted to bring and have this conversation with Stevie is that a lot of people join fraternities and sororities because it's gender affirming, and the support you get from chosen family is often a lifeline. So that second prong is a really important piece. So a lot of conversations haven't happened around non-binary folks. A lot of conversations haven't happened around prong number two. So then a lot of time has been spent on prong number one of who can become a member, which generally our work recommends people who live the values that your organization is founded on. A lot of times how we express or live those values is actually part of our gender expression. It's part of who we are and how we are in the world. So if that's kind of the basics, and then Stevie, I'll see if you have any follow-ups, but the last thing I want to say before your follow-ups is, number one, you're welcome to put Q&A and use the Q&A and post questions. Everyone can read everybody's questions. You can comment on them and you can upvote those questions. You can also send me a text message now or later, including those of you watching the recording. Feel free to send a text at 202-670-4262, and Stevie or I'll get back to you, even if you're watching the recording after the live thing. But we wanted to give you that kind of starting place, and then Stevie, I'll let you kind of riff off of what I just said, see what kind of questions come in before we get into why you joined in the first place. Why don't we start there? Go ahead.
Well, I definitely wanted to follow up and highlight kind of what you shared about gender expression. I think that was fantastic. Just being aware of organizational expectations generally, and kind of the gender expression and how members may look or are expected to look. And so for individuals who may just have a different gender expression, whether that be more butch or not as feminine, that's kind of where, gender expression is the perception, how we express ourselves. And so that's definitely where that can butt up against gender nonconformity, where how we express ourselves and how people perceive us can definitely be different. Because Jess, like Jess says, she's definitely very femme today, according to her, but poor me, I just, I threw Jess under the bus and just called her out for all the things that are not so non-femme. So it's,
It's all
that
good.
is
It's
just
all good.
it's just a matter of perception. And so just imagine, how Jess may feel if, she's feeling super femme today, and I, as her sister, say, "Oh, Jess, you look butchy femme today," you know.
I'm
So
even wearing a tinted chapstick.
so yes, that is definitely important. The two-pronged approach is also important to remember. It's kind of something that organizations miss is first, what does it take to become a member? So for those who are, we admit only women, we admit only men, what does that mean in the context of transgender membership? Does that include create space for trans members who identify as women, who identify as men? And then kind of the second piece is what happens once a member transitions and no longer identifies as a woman. Um, and so that second piece, I think, is definitely a challenge still for many organizations. Not sure if we've received any questions or if you want to jump into kind of why we joined.
Go for it. Why?
Sure.
Hey, Stevie. Why do
Yes.
LGBTQ people join single gendered organizations? Tell me more.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of touched upon it a little bit, but growing up, I definitely did not feel comfortable or safe at home. And it wasn't anything that my parents, expressly did, but it was more kind of just the way that they ran the household. They were first generation immigrants. And so, their priorities were more the bills and keeping us fed. And so as far as kind of emotional support and love, I didn't really have that growing up. In addition to just feeling different, feeling wrong. And so college was really my opportunity to find friends for the first time. I had friends in high school, but it was still the kind where I just wasn't sure if I could be myself or fully authentic around them. And so I really, really wanted to use college as my way to find friends and to really create a space for myself to really figure out like, who am I? Because that was my biggest challenge was I knew I didn't know who I was. And so I just wanted that space as I grappled with my identity. And so um, when I got ready to go to the first Rush event, I remember walking back and forth outside that door 10, 20 times because I remember thinking, I'm a skinny, at the time, gay identified male college student still. That's how I identified. That's what I thought that I was at the time because those were the only words that I had. And so I just never saw myself fitting in a fraternity. I was like, please, like I'm a skinny old nerdy me. That's like the antithesis of what a fraternity may want. But I was lucky enough to go to Arizona State where they had Sigma Phi Beta, and I immediately observed kind of a bond and a social interaction just among the individuals there that I had just never seen before. And so I was immediately attracted because it was almost like I found people like me for the very first time. And so that was very empowering just to be in that space around others who were, as I quickly learned, we went through ritual. And I think that's one of the most important parts that really develops, affinity with each other, with our organization, is that when I was able to go through ritual, I started to hear about my brothers and kind of their experience growing up. And I was just like, that sounds exactly like me. And so, as we started to share our truths and to kind of trust each other with our truths, it almost felt like a natural next step for me to share my truth as well. It only, it only felt right to also contribute that as part of my chapter. And so that's really kind of how I came into be a part of this community, is through just the friendship and love that I was able to experience and observe for the very first time in my life. And really, it was them who modeled for me what friendship looked like, what love looks like amongst friends. I just had never experienced that as even within my family, and so this was really my opportunity to grow, I think, emotionally and socially.
It's interesting hearing that story because I realized also I've been fired from so many university jobs. I said the wrong university, and Stevie's so nice that she didn't even correct me. But it was Arizona State, and then after they fired me, then I went to the University of Arizona. So go Sun Devils. But
Sunday.
yeah, but I remember you as a college student, right? Like
Mhm,
as an advisor. So for those the advisors that are on the call, like I remember being I mean, it feels weird to say this now, but I remember being one of the people that you disclosed things to because I made you feel safe.
mhm.
And then you would leave the office and I would be like, I am woefully unprepared for this. Like, I hope I did okay. I hope I listened okay. I hope I supported this amazing student okay. So, what is interesting, again, along the topic of this, is that there were no fraternities and sororities at my undergrad. I went to a very small school in Arkansas. And I was doing an internship in graduate school at the fraternity and sorority office because I thought I would always work at a small institution. No. And that one of the many hats I would probably wear would be this Greek life, whatever that is thing. And so I assumed I hated it. And I wanted to make sure I hated it. So I did an internship for free to make sure that I hated it. And part of that was the gendered expectations of what a sorority girl was, which growing up in Texas was very similar to the woman that I was supposed to be. That did not turn out, not at all. And so, as while I was doing this internship, which mostly was around folding T-shirts, one of the chapters was recolonizing. At the time, I did not have the language of questioning why are we calling this colonization in South Carolina. This means a lot of things. What's going on? They needed 3 strong women in order to do something for this chapter to kind of recolonize on campus. And I asked women in my cohort. 2 of them said, yes, I'm a strong woman, so I guess I'll be number 3. So I initiated literally the weekend before my comprehensive exams, and I graduated a month later. So not only did I not have an undergrad experience, but I graduated, initiated into Delta Gamma, still holding all of the stereotypes and expectations of what it meant to be a sorority person. I didn't get the ritual. I didn't get the sisterhood. I didn't get the shared meal plans or like, oh my God, you have the same curling iron. I didn't have to do any of that. So that was kind of my welcome, right? So again, professionally, I had done so much work with ACPA and NASPA that at the time when I started speaking and I was represented at the time by Campus Speak, we all had to go to this conference that was called AFA, which I'd never heard of before. So I was such an outsider, but at this point I've gotten used to being an outsider. And part of my gender identity and gender expression is I don't need your approval, I'm an outsider, right? So then even when I eventually came out, I came out very late and I mean it was late for me. It was nobody was surprised except for me. I came out when I was like 27 and everyone, including my grandmother, was like, "Uh-huh. Yeah, we know." I didn't know, but I didn't have the language and I didn't have access. I just knew that I wasn't particularly feminine. But then as kind of a baby dyke, if I can call myself that, I also noticed as someone who identified as more masculine that I was supposed to be attracted to feminine people and I wasn't. I was attracted to masculinity, but I wasn't straight. But I didn't know how to navigate that. But I'm also not a man. But I certainly didn't have that language at the time. Anyway, so here I am at AFA, and all these colleagues that I knew from these other higher ed institutions are coming through to register. And they're like, what are you doing here? And it made me feel even more like an outsider, except they held me in like a really high regard professionally. So I didn't know that. So, oh, thank you, Crystal. AFA is you already wrote it, Association of Fraternity and Sorority Advisors. So then again, as an outsider who also is very worried about my gender performance within a professional setting, I like packed all my pearls, right? Like I've never worn pearls in public, but I wore them then because I was at a sorority thing. What is even happening, right? There's this pressure that no one was putting on me except for me. but how can I be true to myself and be me and navigate this new place? And so I found a place where I felt like my talents or my expertise could be utilized, and that was working with gender identity and gender expression inclusion or exclusion, be specific, within organizations. And as I was able to bring my professional self in, I also am getting older, and in my own relationships, I actually had my first long term relationship. So I was getting a little bit more comfortable with who I was. And it was actually at a UIFI where I can't remember, Crystal, what UIFI stands for. It's Undergrad Institute.
Undergraduate Interfraternity Institute.
There you go. Look at this. Y'all are winning all the spelling quizzes. So this is a organization that undergrads go to learn about leadership skills, etc., and then they take them back to their respective campus chapter or council leadership positions. So as a small group facilitator, or maybe it was at a large, I was a large group facilitator at that point, I can't remember. There was this group of women that found out that I was a Delta Gamma, and that didn't mean anything to me yet because I hadn't really connected into whatever that means. And they pulled me off aside into a side room, and we did this secret thing, which I didn't understand secret things. And that is the first time I ever had access to really what the values of Delta Gamma actually meant. And if we're being really honest, it's the connection to those values that brought me back more as a volunteer or as an advisor, not from a professional place, but from a personal place. And that personal place is my very fundamental to my gender identity and my gender expression. And if we're really being honest, I'm now 47 years old. I know, I have good skin. But it's inside this last year of COVID, I got invited to a group chat of my sisters who are all different ages from all around the country. I don't know a lot of them. I don't know that I've met all of them in person. But that is literally the first time I have truly experienced what I think is called sisterhood, where I was accepted as who I am, not just as a professional expert, but as a woman, and a woman who's in complicated relationships, and I'm allowed to like talk about the complications of my relationship and how that impacts who I am and how I want to be in the world. And the fundamental thread are these values. Whereas professionally, those values were kind of a cliche catch line. The values are so alive in the connection of this group of women that I just literally within this last year have realized that I have never felt connected to women. Even as someone who identifies as a lesbian, I haven't felt connected to a woman in a way that wasn't a sexual or an emotional relationship, but that is actually about being a person with other people. And part of the like, yes, I will do this webinar, is that that is what you should be giving. Whether you're an alumni, you're a volunteer, whether you are an alumni initiate, whether you're just somebody else on the planet, eventually it becomes a habit, and you start treating everybody like a sister, and you start treating everybody like a sibling, because that's the values of the organization. So I've never been more proud to be a Delta Gamma, but it's certainly taken a while to really get what that means. So.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, when I met you in undergrad, I think what we were discussing was that I was afraid to go home and visit my family during the holiday break because that was going to be 24/7 at home with them. And at the time, my gender expression was quickly changing because of the support of my chapter. I started growing my hair out. I started playing around with more colorful fabrics, more colorful powders, makeup, whatever I wanted to do just to figure out how I wanted to express myself and what really felt most comfortable to me. I started becoming very afraid of, the rejection and from my family. And so kind of going through that and talking that out with my brothers definitely was, I think, a common experience for all of us. And so although they may not have understood kind of how far I was taking my gender identity and expression, and that was something, I think that's something that we'll talk about in a little bit, is, supporting a transitioning member
Mhm.
and maybe not being able to relate to their experiences. But I think something that really grounded us was that we all had our own unique challenges, especially with our families being queer. And so, regardless of my own barriers and hurdles that I had with my parents, I think there was that commonality that I could at least talk about. I could go out to lunch, I could eat dinner with my friends and have that space. So really, it was the that friendship, kind of like Jess was saying. It wasn't anything special that I think that my fraternity brothers did for me, more than just having um, someone I could go out to eat with and have dinner with, sign up for classes together with, go to the computing lab together with. I mean, just basic things like that. So I just didn't feel alone on campus and always had someone with me. That was really kind of the most important piece, was just that friendship and that support.
And isn't it fascinating how now that I'm what I feel like an outsider on the inside, right? But there's way more outsiders than me. And so like the big stereotype is you buy your friends, right? But everybody buys their friends. Like that's what dinner's for, right? Like that's what's happening. What's different is to feel whole even if there's nothing going on.
Hmm.
You don't like I didn't know that people could care for each other in an everyday mundane kind of way because they care. I thought that there had like your parents died, right? Or like when my parents died there were people who were there for me and then the dust settled and then they were gone. I didn't know that you could care about someone just cuz it's Wednesday. And
Hmm.
I learned that from Sisterhood, but it directly impacted my ability to accept myself and to lean into my gender expression and how that shows up with values. So we don't have any specific questions that have come in yet, so I'm just going to plug it one more time. But 202-670-4262 is the texting number. I'll put it in the chat as well. And then, Stevie, I know you were we did get some messages from the Facebook group when we knew that this webinar was coming. And so one of the questions that came in beforehand was to really talk about why LGBTQ members stay involved even after they come out or after transitioning or beginning to transition or whatever those kind of things. You talked a little bit about chosen family.
Hmm.
But can you talk a little bit, and I know this just because I know you personally, how the chosen family has extended long outside, far outside of just your college experience?
Hmm. I mean, I I will say that I'm very lucky. I don't know how I was so lucky, but I'm very lucky to have found my chapter. And so that was really my starting point. And so by the time I transitioned, and by the time I think that my gender identity shifted away from male, I think that the bonds of family and friendship had already been built. And so something that I hear my fraternity brothers talk about a lot when, people ask is, well, that's just Stevie. We've known her all along. She's been with us from the beginning. And so that has always been very empowering for me to know that I am always a part of my fraternity. But part of that also has been through the work that I've been lucky enough to do, just pushing policy work. And so I had practice within my own organization, because when I started transitioning, we didn't have a policy in our fraternity. And I think my questions were kind of the catalyst to really considering what we do with members like me. Because I remember going into my Greek advisor's office and asking, if I no longer identify as male, am I going to get kicked out of my chapter? Because that's the last thing I wanted. I mean, I put in all this effort. I built these bonds of trust and love that encouraged me to get to this point. And the last thing I would want is to lose that.
Mhm.
And so those were questions I was asking. I would ask, even at the IFC meetings, I would just wonder, if I still am here and within my chapter, are we going to get kicked out of IFC? And no one really had an answer. And something that I think that was very powerful is that the alumni within my fraternity took it upon themselves to do some research, meet with community members and work to develop a policy on gender. And that really was affirming for me as a member of my commitment to the community. And that policy basically said that for those who identify as male, regardless of what your identity documents say or what you were assigned at birth, you would be eligible to join our organization. And if you change your gender identity away from male after you joined, that would never ever jeopardize your membership within the organization. And I know that it's just words and we talk about kind of the limitations of policy, but for me as just an active collegian, just to have those words on paper and to see it and really was affirming because it really removed all the doubt that I had and the questions and the anxiety and the fear about being rejected again or potentially again by yet another group of individuals. And so that work has really been instrumental in kind of creating powerful friendships and networks across the community because this is an issue that impacts all of us. And so I have been very lucky to have met so many individuals who, like you said, that's just Stevie. And they have, didn't know me in undergrad, but the fraternal community, with the values of honesty, love, friendship, wisdom, I think these are all things that can help bridge differences or perceived differences, and really create kind of, I don't know, that can really resonate, I think, within all of us.
Mm-hmm. I know that I want to add some of the things because we are getting some questions now. And so, Stevie,
Mhm.
one, I want to give you a chance to prep. I put one in our little shared sheet, so you should read
Yeah.
that. But what I think is important is Stevie, you self-identified as a skinny nerd. Like you're still a skinny nerd. That hasn't changed, right? But you're also a force to be reckoned with. That was there as an undergrad, and now you've come into yourself, right? So
Mhm.
in a lot of ways, being able to stay in touch with you over these years, I see a very similar arc in me. I'm just a lot slower at it than you. That I've come into myself in a way. So one of the questions is well, how do we attract folks to let them know that it's not a bad place, like it is a affirming place? And you need to understand, and whether this is a trauma response or not, that I often, like, I'll just speak for myself, but I would rather make myself the punchline than someone else make me the punchline. And so I think that I gave up a lot of opportunities because I assumed I wasn't going to fit in. So I bolted before you kicked me out. And so when asking, like, well, how do we attract people? You need to understand that there are people who might be interested but don't feel welcome, and there's nothing you've done yet. So you're just going to have to work on actually being welcomed, being welcoming, present progressive tense. And the word will get out to some people, and to other people, they're going to run away. Some people are in a fraternity and sorority because they're trying to affirm a gender identity and expression that isn't actually true to who they are. And as they learn who they are, deuces, I'm not doing this anymore. Right? Like, I the closest thing I can come to that is when I made straight A's and my grandmother, as a prize, I got to go to cotillion. So I always, for the rest of school, missed one homework assignment. So I always made just slightly less than straight A's. I never had to go to cotillion again. Da-da-da, I win. My whole family was disappointed, but get used to it. But eventually, that disappointment lessened, not because I became less disappointing, but because I became more of a force of who I am. And the force of who I am is wrapped up in how I live my values and how I show up with other people. Not 100% of the time. I am still a jerk. Ask my partner. We've been sheltering in place together. I'm sure jerk points have been earned. But I'm more secure in who I am because I have a group of people affirming that just being instead of accomplishing actually matters. And how I am being is very much related to my sense of self, my body image issues, my gender identity, my gender expression, the roles I play, and how I support and advise other people. So the other question that came in, Stevie, is specific to you and your family now. So I wanted to see
Yeah,
if you wanted to chat on it. And I know you, so I
absolutely.
wanted to give you a second.
Yeah, so by the time I graduated, I think that I was identifying as genderqueer. So genderqueer is a little bit similar, is similar to non-binary.
Mhm.
It was my way of rejecting the male female dichotomy and really giving myself space to thrive. And so my senior year, I think a couple weeks before graduation, I hand wrote my parents a letter coming out to them, and I put in a couple books that kind of on the last couple pages, and I sent it to them, and didn't really hear anything. I was like, okay, so we'll see. Weeks go by, and my parents come down to Arizona for my graduation, and I unfortunately my worst fears came to realization. By that time, I think on that day in particular, I had just walked out of my last final, so I was a little bit grungy, probably wearing some senior year's clothing, probably smelled a little bit. I mean, it was my last final, senioritis. And so, I wasn't the most femme, I would say, at the time, but I certainly wasn't, I definitely did not, was not masculine anymore. I think that I could never pass as masculine my senior year. And so, I drove out to see them, and my parents, took one look at me and kind of just sent me away in tears. My dad kind of just, went off on me. Look at you. You look like a freak. Who are you? You're not my son. I don't know who you are. I only came to take everything back. So give me back the car, give me back the cell phone. And then I walked home on the sidewalk because I didn't have a car anymore, just crying. And so that was very difficult. And that was something, a fear that I had had ever since I grew up, just that was going to happen to me. And so, when I highlight family, my fraternity brothers really came in and saved me from becoming a statistic. I mean, I literally did not have a place to stay. I was struggling to find a job. And so after graduation, I ended up sleeping on my fraternity brothers' couches. I shared a bed with one of my fraternity brothers for 2 months because that was all I had. And then when he moved away, I slept on another fraternity brother's couch. And then another fraternity brother helped me to find a job. And yet another one, gave me his truck, let me borrow it so I could get to my job. And so I think about that often, all the time actually, because I mean that's family, and I really would not be here if it weren't for them. And so I think about that, and so the opportunities that you have as a sisterhood to provide that love and support and friendship is really real. And so just think about the life that you could impact. Sorry, I'm getting mushy gushy.
It's allowed. One of us needs to. Well, so Stevie, thank you for sharing your story. And I know that when we have these kind of conversations, there's like a default to like pain parades, and so
Hmm.
I just want to honor that you're sharing pain that is not past tense, and
Hmm.
possibly some of that pain is also what fuels your amazing work that you are doing.
Hmm.
And I'm so grateful that you've been able to find a chosen family that chose you back, because you're amazing, you're incredible. um,
Yeah.
Part of the amazing, incredible things that I think you're able to do, look at this transition, is work with other organizations specifically. I know that you've been doing a lot of work recently, and we said we'd come back to it. I'm also looking at the clock. Um, about non-binary individuals and how that
Hmm.
impacts fraternities and sororities. I think that you and I both kind of have a what's the next conversation, which is hard to do when some people are still having what we would call like a first conversation.
Yep.
But I want to make sure that we have time tonight to talk about it. So why don't you talk about how non-binary is showing up in the next conversation, and then I'll take it from what I think is going to be the next conversation.
Absolutely. So non-binary is actually part of the next conversation. And so I want to maybe take a step back and think about our organization and kind of the legal framework. And so, like Jess said, single sex organization may not be the right way to define us, because if we kind of examine the definition of single sex, a lot of our practices, probably 100% of our practices, don't involve genitalia. We don't know the sex of the members going through our recruitment processes. What we have instead is that we conflate gender with sex. And so we look at someone and say, oh, they look pretty femme. They're probably a woman and they could therefore be eligible for our organization. Or, oh, that person looks pretty masculine. They're probably a guy, so they can join our fraternity. And so unless you have a potential new member who actually outs themselves or maybe may have a gender expression that is non-typical, I think it would be difficult to, see someone who's trans. Obviously, we can talk about the difficulties and the challenges of, passing and access to resources and all that stuff. But you don't really know someone's sex unless, so they share that with you. So that's kind of the limitations as we describe our organizations as single sex, especially when we talk about trans membership, because then what is sex for our organizations? Are we really single sex anymore? What about for trans members who no longer identify as women? You may certainly have now alumni members who identify as men. Does that mean you're no longer a single sex organization? And so something that I always try to challenge people to think about is, can we maybe get away from that term because of how limiting it is and think of our spaces maybe as women's spaces and men's spaces? From a social standpoint, I think about kind of gender and what these spaces are meant to do. And I think the most important part is to develop what it means to be a woman, a strong woman, a woman of character. And so from a social experience, these spaces are definitely places where members work together to combat and dismantle expectations of gender, whether that be expectations that are placed on women or expectations that are placed on men. And so trying to redefine what it means to be a woman in today's society, a leader, strong, these types of ideas. And so as you're dismantling, redefining gender, I think about, is there space within your sisterhood, within your brotherhood, for other individuals who are also doing the same work? Non-binary individuals like you are dismantling gender. They just may be doing it in a more radical way, or maybe taking it in a step that you may not think about. But at the end of the day, we're all, I would say, kind of gender demolition crews. So as members, you may be cisgender, but you certainly are breaking down the walls that divide the idea of man and woman, and kind of blurring those rigidities. And so as you're dismantling these walls, is there room to learn from individuals who are breaking down the walls to build a hallway? Maybe you don't want a hallway, but are there tools that you could borrow from each other, as non-binary individuals are breaking down the wall to build a hallway, to build an extra room into their home? And so I think about that ability as a sorority, as a brotherhood, as a fraternity, I'm sorry, sorority as a brotherhood, to really create a space where individuals who push back against gender and all its kind of expectations can maybe thrive in the same space. So I'm sure that those conversations you're having about redefining womanhood can certainly be relatable to those who just reject womanhood as a whole. And these issues that impact us all, I just think about kind of even just women's health, breast cancer awareness, for example, thinking about women who may not have a stereotypical feminine expression trying to access healthcare. These challenges that all women face regardless of our gender expression. So not only, the health concerns for women, but thinking about all these other individuals who may not even be able to get through the door to access and to the resources that women across the board still need and deserve.
Excellent. Well, I
Mhm.
think that this may be the most sorority thing I'm going to probably do, maybe in the next month or so. So, Stevie, you're going to get the last word, but it is actually my chosen. I don't know that big sisters and little sisters are supposed to be a thing, but I didn't have any of that, so I chose a big sister, and she has asked a question specifically in reference to gender informed versus gender exclusionary. So I'm going to give you a chance to read that, and then that will be probably the last question of the webinar. But when Stevie and I were talking, we both wanted to make sure, like, okay, what is the next conversation in your work? What's the next conversation in my work? And so when we were talking, what I said, I think, is the next conversation, to which, if I can quote Stevie, was, damn, I, I. So here you go. So there's your warning.
Yeah.
What is immensely frustrating to me is that specifically historically white fraternities and sororities are more likely to actually develop a policy around white non-binary students, undergraduate students, alumni initiates, volunteers, etc. Similarly to how so much work has been done around white gay and lesbian members about whether or not they can be a member or can't be a member, as well as usually white trans binary gender affirming members can become a member or stay a member, then we are actually engaging in a conversation about cisgender people of color becoming members of historically white fraternities and sororities. We're doing a lot of work to not have a conversation about racial inclusion of historically white organizations. And one of the strongest pieces that I would recommend if you have any work within a historically white fraternity or sorority is to notice that the councils of historically not white organizations, historical fraternities and sororities, whether they be Asian, Latino, black fraternities and sororities, have done more work around what it means to be gender inclusive, what gender identity or gender expression means, how that aligns with their values, what does it mean when someone is non-binary or gender non-conforming, and how can they become and or stay a member. The historically white organizations, as per usual, could learn from these councils and these organizations that tend to be smaller, tend to have less money, but have done significantly more work when we're talking about sexual orientation, sexual identity, and expression and gender roles, and how that aligns with an organizational's values. Until we begin to have a conversation about straight cisgender folks of color who are interested or also need to be welcomed as a potential new member within a historically white fraternity or sorority, I don't believe that we are addressing the relevance that we could have on college campuses. That is the next conversation that I'm hoping to have. So, with that, Stevie, take it away with my big question. Thank you very much.
Yes. So any promise in the idea of gender-informed organizations rather than gender exclusive? That is a fantastic question, and I don't know if I have an answer for it right now. I will say that the layers of multiculturalism are definitely very diverse. So something that we have definitely encountered through our work on my end is that multiculturalism doesn't may or may not include every aspect of diversity that we can think about. And so, not to name any organizations in particular, but there are certain organizations that are formed as a multicultural group around kind of culture. And then when it comes to LGBT individuals, we've actually encountered a number of groups where the founders have come out and said, actually, multicultural is multicultural, but we didn't mean the LGBT piece. And so that's also a layer to consider. It's not, it definitely varies from organization to organization, but there's also that piece as well where multicultural may not be inclusive of LGBT individuals. Um, so just to throw a wrench into things and make the conversation a little bit more convoluted.
Yeah. And that's the exciting thing is that I believe when a fraternity or sorority, a professional association, etc., I use exactly the same language. And that is that there is a set of community standards that we are holding ourselves to because fundamentally they are higher standards. We are not talking about a fundamental Bill of Rights. We're not talking about state law. We're not talking about federal law. We're talking about a membership based organization that, by virtue of opting in to what is required of members, you have agreed to live your life to a higher standard within the professional industry or within this fraternity and sorority. And by holding yourself to that higher standard, this is how we mean that. And then how that higher standard shows up should be so directly in line with the values of that organization that it's not punitive, it's actually an inclusive invitation for people to be able to live by those standards. I think that there should be a low bar for entry and a high bar to stay. And if that high bar is based on the shared values of that organization, then that shared organization has a purpose. And that greater purpose is why we are all here tonight. So that's pretty much, those are all of the questions. Last call, 202-670-4262. Use the Q&A, use the chat, do whatever you need to do. But that's all we have so far. Stevie, do you want to take the final word?
Oh my gosh, put me in the spotlight. Do you want to go first? I don't know what to say.
I think the thing that is most important is that nobody feels like they're the one that is supposed to do the thing. And so we're waiting around for somebody else to do the thing. And the reality is that people are already doing the thing and they're tired and they need you to come in for second shift so they can take some time off. Whatever that thing, whatever that may be, right? So a couple, I think last week I actually met with two incredible, amazing women who are both members of Alpha Gamma Delta. They are able to put together their experience as one of the first Black chapter presidents and one of the first lesbian chapter presidents through their own DEI work and actually do and implement what they're calling stories of audacity. And through their stories of audacity, what they're talking about is living shared values, regardless of what organization you belong to. The ability to share your story of audacity allows someone else to take care of themselves and come back to work. So that would be my biggest thing. And honestly, Stevie, that's what I've learned most from you. So thanks for being my sister.
Oh, heart.
Hearts, I can't.
Oh, there. Yeah, I guess I would say that, man, what would I say? I had it on like the tip of my tongue, but now I guess, so yes, so here it is. I think the most important thing to remember is that although you may not understand what everyone in your chapter or your organization is going through, maybe I just grounding your approach through love and friendship and your values and seeing, I think, each person's authenticity as kind of the revelation of, or kind of a culmination of living and displaying values. And so maybe not seeing it as I don't understand, but this is their truth that they have chosen to share with us, with the sisterhood, and kind of treating it that way, in the same way that any other sister who shares their truth or something personal about themselves, you may not understand, but I think the act of that sharing is very powerful. And so just coming at it from that lens and just, not, if you don't understand, I think that what we're all taught is that friendship and love is probably the answer. And we all know how to do that, I think.
One would hope. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here tonight. If you have any questions, you're welcome to text message anytime you like. If it's a smart question, I'll send it to Stevie. If it's a funny question, I'll probably wing it. But the number again is 202-670-4262. Stevie and I talk regularly, and we're happy to help in whatever way we can when the questions come up. Just send a text message. My dog is scared of all noises, so it doesn't make any noise. Just send a text. I'll get to it when I can. Otherwise, thank you very much. Happy Pride, Stevie.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
Yay. Thank you very much. Good night, y'all.